Chosen one. Somewhere, someone is staring at a blank screen, paralyzed by the silence you've left behind. They once moved with the arrogance of someone who assumed you would always be available, but your withdrawal has shattered that illusion. The reality is sinking in. Your absence just confirmed their worst fear. You really don't need them anymore. You are finally untouchable, and their panic is your vindication. A dynamic was constructed, not necessarily with conscious intention, not with a plan written down anywhere, but through choices made repeatedly, patterns practiced until they became invisible, behaviors normalized until they felt like simply the way things were. A structure took shape over time, and that structure was designed, whether they knew it or not, to keep you exactly where you could be managed. Close enough to be useful, far enough from your own power to remain reachable. That structure operated through 3 specific mechanisms, and you need to understand each one. The first mechanism was inconsistency. The warmth was never reliable. The coldness was never predictable. The temperature between you shifted in a rhythm just erratic enough to keep you perpetually off balance. Here is why that mattered. Genuine, steady warmth creates security in a person. Security means you stop chasing, you stop auditioning for approval, you stop measuring your okayness against someone else's mood. Consistent warmth would have made you independent, and independence was the one condition that dismantled their leverage entirely. So the temperature rotated deliberately, enough affection to hold you in place, enough withdrawal to keep you working for more. The second mechanism was reframing. Your feelings, your actual valid, reasonable responses to being treated with inconsistency were never permitted to land as legitimate truth. They were redirected and relabeled. You were told you were overreacting, overthinking, manufacturing problems where none existed. The third mechanism, the one that held everything else together, was assumption. It was the deep, foundational, unexamined belief that you would always be there, that no matter how far the line was pushed, your attachment to them would outlast your attachment to your own peace, that the fear of losing them would permanently outweigh the cost of staying. That belief was the entire foundation of their position in that dynamic. Assumptions about people who are still in the process of becoming themselves are always a gamble, because people grow, people accumulate clarity. People arrive quietly and irrevocably at a threshold, and when they do, everything built on the assumption that they never would collapses without warning. The foundation they built looked permanent. You were about to reveal it was sand. It built slowly, the way water fills a container that has no visible overflow point, until one ordinary moment it is simply everywhere, and there is no containing it and no returning it to where it was. Every instance where you noticed the pattern and extended grace anyway added weight. Every conversation where you articulated your feelings clearly and watched them get minimized added weight. Every time the warmth returned, just long enough to re-engage you and then disappeared the moment you settled, added weight. Every time you brought patience to a situation that responded to that patience with more of the same behavior, added weight. Each of those moments contributed to something that was quietly, invisibly reaching its limit, and then there was one final moment. You know exactly which one it was. Maybe it was something said or pointedly not said. Maybe it was a choice you witnessed and finally, completely refused to rationalize. Maybe there was no dramatic incident at all. Maybe the container simply overflowed in an unremarkable moment, and you looked clearly at what had been slowly flooding the space around you and made a single, complete decision. Enough. That word was never spoken out loud. It was not posted, not sent, not delivered as a tearful confrontation they could later twist into evidence of your instability. You made the decision in the privacy of your own mind, with the authority of someone who had finally stopped waiting for external permission to protect their own peace. And then you did the one thing that rewrote every rule of the dynamic. You went silent. No warning was issued, no final ultimatum was deployed to test whether they would finally respond differently. You simply withdrew. You stopped being available. You stopped feeding the dynamic with your engagement. And in doing that, you removed the one resource their entire structure depended on to function, your participation. If this message awakens something within you, hype this video for other chosen ones who need to hear this. They do not run on love, they run on engagement. You're reaching, you're explaining, you're hoping, you're trying. All of that was fuel. Even your frustration was fuel. Even your attempts to make them understand were fuel. The dynamic had power as long as you remained emotionally in range, in any form. The moment you withdrew that engagement entirely, the structure had nothing left to consume, and a structure built for consumption, when it suddenly has nothing to consume, does not gracefully wind down, it collapses inward, it begins to feed on the person at its center. That is what your silence set in motion, not immediately, but without any possibility of being stopped. In the early stretch of your silence, there was no alarm. There was actually a kind of confidence on their end. Your going quiet had happened before. It was familiar. It fit a pattern they had navigated successfully. You would pull back, some time would pass, and then either you would return or they would extend just enough warmth to draw you back in. The cycle had always completed itself. There was no reason in their mind to believe this time was different. So they waited, with the particular ease of someone who has never genuinely had to reckon with losing something because it had always come back before. But the silence held, and that ease began to erode at its edges. The first thing they looked for was your distress. Not because they wanted you to suffer, but because your suffering would have confirmed the narrative they needed. It would have meant you were struggling without them, that the absence was costing you more than it was costing them. So they looked at your profile, at what you were sharing, at anything visible from the outside that might tell them how you were doing. What they found was not distress. You were living, quietly or otherwise, but living, and living without the visible anguish that would have served as evidence for their theory. That was where the first real fracture appeared. The checking intensified. It became more deliberate, more frequent, more pointed. Old exchanges were revisited, moments were replayed, the search expanded to the edges, mutual contacts, shared spaces, anywhere that might deliver information about who you were becoming and whether their absence had made its expected impact on you. What they were discovering, and this is where the fear began to take real shape, was that you were not performing recovery for an audience. You were not making your okayness visible as a strategy. You were simply moving forward, and forward motion from someone who was supposed to be diminished by your absence is the most disorienting thing a person who counted on that diminishment can encounter. Pride began negotiating with desperation. Messages were composed and never sent. Approaches through indirect channels were attempted with what they believed was subtlety. And underneath all of it, something was dawning, something they were not yet able to articulate, but could feel arriving the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Look, you already know the attacks weren't random, and if you're paying attention, you can feel it. Their walls are closing in. You've also noticed something else. A lot of Chosen One channels on YouTube have gone quiet, videos removed, voices pushed off the platform. The mainstream media is cracking down on us, but we will not give up our voice. So let's talk about what we're doing about it. That's why I built Destiny Engine. And when you join, you're not just supporting your favorite channels, you're also fueling your own rise. It's a 360 win. It generates personalized sequences that help you rewire betrayal into transcendence, turn isolation into sacred power, and transform their downfall into your rise. We are using the Dark Elite's own weapons against them, taking their declassified consciousness technology that programmed competition and scarcity and repurposing it to serve cooperative intelligence. The beauty is, you don't even have to lift a finger. You put on the headphones, press play, and your subconscious is rewired, while your enemies collapse under the weight of their own lies. This is why I created it in the beginning, so everything they did to break you becomes fuel for your purpose. The collective upgrade is underway. Start your Destiny Engine for $7 today and watch divine justice accelerate in your life. Link in the description. You were not coming back. Not the way you had come back before, with enough softness remaining that the cycle could complete itself. This silence carried different weight. This silence had the quality of a decision already made internally, made completely, and without any appetite for revisiting. It was not building toward a confrontation. It had already passed through one, privately and on your own terms, and emerged on the other side as something final. That is when the fear they had been quietly carrying, the fear underneath all the posturing and control, finally arrived in full. Because what they were sensing was not simply your absence, they were sensing your indifference. And indifference from someone who once cared with genuine depth is the most destabilizing force that exists in the landscape of human connection. Anger can be managed, hurt can be navigated. Even hatred provides something solid to push against, some confirmation that you still matter enough to evoke strong feeling, but indifference communicates something that none of those emotions do. Indifference says you no longer register as significant. It says the emotional territory they once occupied has been fully reclaimed and repurposed. It says you have become, to someone who once treated you as the center of their emotional world, genuinely irrelevant. That realization does not arrive gently. It arrives like a verdict. What is taking place inside them right now is not simple sadness. It is cognitive warfare. You need to understand this, not to gloat, but because understanding it fully illuminates what your departure actually produced. Two completely incompatible realities are running simultaneously in their mind. The first is the one their ego requires. You are struggling, you are not doing as well as you appear, and you will eventually reach out or return because you need them. This version of reality protects the identity they constructed around being needed by you. It demands your suffering as ongoing evidence, and every time they search for proof of that suffering and cannot find it, this version becomes harder and harder to sustain. The second reality is the one they cannot silence. You are genuinely fine, more than fine. Something in you opened rather than broke when you left. You are moving through your life with a quality of ease that is visible even from a distance, and it is not the performed ease of someone pretending to be okay. It carries the specific quality of someone who has set down a weight they had been carrying so long they had forgotten what moving freely felt like. These two realities cannot coexist without causing serious internal fracture, and that fracture is exactly what is happening. Moments from the past are being revisited with uncomfortable new clarity. Your patience, which they once read as a kind of permanent resource, is now visible in retrospect as something far more costly, something extended generously to someone who did not earn it and will not get the opportunity to waste it again. That reframe is not something you delivered. It arrived on its own, through the simple, undeniable logic of your absence. Here is the particular power of self-indictment over external accusation. You cannot argue yourself out of your own memory. You can dismiss what another person says about you. You cannot dismiss what you yourself lived through and chose. Every moment of dismissal, every crossed boundary, every time comfort was chosen over genuine care, all of it lives in their own recall as evidence they cannot cross-examine or suppress. And what that evidence confirms is that they were not, in those critical moments, someone worthy of what they had. They know this. The knowing is the reckoning. And unlike an accusation that fades with distance, a reckoning rooted this deeply in self-knowledge does not diminish with time. It compounds. This is not abstract. This is happening in real time, and you deserve to understand the specific texture of what your absence has set in motion. Conversations are being rehearsed that will never be sent, in transit somewhere, in the quiet before sleep arrives, in unguarded moments when the performance of having moved on drops and the actual internal state surfaces. The words are being assembled, the explanation, the justification, the version of an apology that still somehow centers their own discomfort. These words are being refined and revised and then tucked away again, because the same pride that contributed to the collapse of what you had is still present enough to block the sending. Your life is being monitored through every available angle, not just what is directly visible, the edges too, the periphery, anything that might deliver information about who you are becoming without them. This surveillance is not something they would acknowledge to anyone. But it is compulsive because the information being gathered is the only available answer to the question that has taken up permanent residence in their mind. Have you moved on? The answer they fear most is not that you have moved on towards someone else. That would actually be easier to process because it would give them something external to point at, a narrative that positions them as the abandoned party rather than the person whose own behavior produced the outcome. What genuinely terrifies them is a different answer entirely, that you have moved on toward yourself, that the peace you are living in, the ease you are carrying, the version of you that is emerging, none of it requires their presence as a component, that their absence from your life is not something you are recovering from, it is something you are expanding into. That answer removes every remaining narrative that protected their sense of significance. It reframes the entire connection, not as something that ended too soon, but as a weight you finally laid down. And that reframing positions them not as the protagonist of something lost, but as the burden that had to be released before you could breathe fully. There is no version of being someone's burden that carries dignity, and that is exactly what they are sitting with right now. Meanwhile, replacement strategies are being tested. Noise is being used to fill the quiet, because the quiet is where your absence lives most loudly. New distractions, busier schedules, connections pursued with urgency, all of it deployed in service of not having to feel the specific shape of what is missing. But something keeps failing to resolve. Every distraction reaches its limit and deposits them back at the same unwelcome recognition. What you gave was specific to you. The quality of your presence, your realness, your way of genuinely seeing people and showing up for them, none of that is interchangeable. None of it can be found somewhere else on demand. It either exists in a person or it does not, and the person they are learning this from is no longer offering it to them. That lesson does not soften with time, it deepens. There is a layer underneath all of this that requires a particular kind of honesty to see, and it is the most damning layer of all because it lives inside them, in their own unedited memory, entirely beyond anyone's ability to challenge or revise. They knew, before you left, they knew you were leaving. Not in the sudden dramatic way they may describe it to others, but gradually, observably, in real time. The shift in your energy was not subtle to anyone paying attention. The quality of your presence changed. The warmth you had always extended became more measured. The automatic reaching they had come to rely on became deliberate, then became less frequent, then became something that cost you effort that had previously been effortless. They felt every stage of that shift, and they made a choice in response to it. They decided you would stay anyway. They calculated, consciously or otherwise, that the pattern of you absorbing, forgiving, and continuing had enough momentum to outlast whatever was shifting in you, that the discomfort of losing you gradually was still more manageable than the discomfort of actually changing, that their comfort was worth more than the risk of what genuine accountability might require from them. So instead of meeting the moment with something real, instead of rising to meet you where you actually were, they doubled down on the same behavior that was already creating distance. They withdrew when you needed presence. They deflected when you needed acknowledgement. They chose the same patterns that were already costing them, not because they lacked the awareness that something was shifting, but because the depth of their comfort with a slow loss had not yet collided with the reality of what a complete one would actually feel like. Now that collision has happened, and what they are living inside is the gap between who they chose to be in those critical moments and who they would have needed to be to keep what they had. That gap is not abstract. It is built from specific individual choices made at specific moments when a different choice was entirely possible and was not taken. You gave every available signal. You provided every reasonable opportunity for something different to happen. You brought patience to a situation that responded to your patience by assuming it was inexhaustible. And when it finally exhausted, when you took them at their word about what they were actually willing to offer, you honored that truth by leaving it behind. They will never deliver this version of events to another person, but they live inside it every single day. And this is the version that will not let them rest. When you removed yourself from that dynamic, something began, something that had nothing to do with them and everything to do with the truth of who you have always been underneath the weight of what you were carrying. Real space opened. Not the manufactured space of a brief conflict, not the temporary relief of someone backing away just to return. Genuine, expansive space opened, space that had previously been consumed by the constant, low-level management of a one-sided connection. All the energy that had gone toward translating signals that should have been clear, toward monitoring someone else's emotional temperature, toward allocating your resources to something that kept returning less than what was put in, all of that energy became yours again. Entirely, completely yours. In that space you started hearing yourself again. Not the version of you that had been gradually adjusted and edited in response to someone who required you smaller. Your actual voice, the one with genuine preferences, real instincts and a clear internal sense of what feels right and what does not, independent of whether anyone else validates it. That version of you had not disappeared. It had simply been patient, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to fully surface. Those conditions arrived the moment you chose your own peace over the maintenance of someone else's comfort. The return did not arrive with fanfare. Real shifts in a person's inner life rarely announce themselves loudly. It came incrementally, a morning that landed with a different quality, a conversation that felt genuinely nourishing instead of something you were only half present for, a creative impulse that found bandwidth to be followed rather than being set aside, laughter that required no effort to produce, rest that arrived without anxiety preceding it. These were days that belonged to you in a way they had not recently. And accumulating underneath all of those small shifts, building with each passing day of choosing yourself, was something that is difficult to name precisely, but unmistakable in a person who has arrived at it. Certainty, not the performance of confidence, not the loud self-assurance of someone who needs to outperform others to feel secure, the quiet, settled, unshakable certainty of a person who has arrived at a clear understanding of their own worth and who no longer requires anyone else's recognition of it to treat that worth as real. This certainty has no need to announce itself. It radiates without effort. It changes the quality of your presence everywhere you go. It draws toward you what is genuinely aligned with who you are, because you are no longer partially occupied by something that was consuming you. They will reach out, count on it if it has not happened already. It will arrive quietly, a message framed as casual, something presented as a memory they simply could not help sharing, or a check-in designed to sound like it requires nothing in return. An approach through someone connected to both of you that is constructed to feel accidental, something calibrated to be low risk enough that if you do not respond, the attempt can be internally minimized, but just significant enough that if you do respond, an opening is created. What that message is not is transformation. It is not a changed person arriving with genuine accountability and demonstrably different behavior. It is someone who has discovered that what they took for granted is no longer available on their terms and who is testing whether the right amount of effort might restore that availability. The effort being extended is not proportional to the actual cost of what you experienced. It is proportional to the minimum they calculate is required to bring you back. Watch for this carefully, because the feeling it produces will be real and significant. The acknowledgement, the reaching, the apparent evidence that they finally understand what they discarded, all of that will move through you, and in the middle of that wave, the dynamic that was specifically built to keep you cycling through engagement will attempt to reactivate. You now carry something you did not have when you first entered this. You have lived experience of what that connection cost you and what your life actually looks and feels like in its absence. You carry the embodied knowledge of the weight you set down. You know the difference between carrying it and not in the specific texture of your daily experience. And no message, regardless of how it is constructed, has the power to erase that knowledge. The relevant question when someone returns after taking you for granted has never been simply whether they changed. The question is whether the change is substantive or surface level. Substantive change is not announced, it is demonstrated. It arrives through consistent behavior sustained over an extended period, not through a well-timed reach designed to interrupt your forward movement. It shows up in patterns that hold even when nothing is being observed, not in performances delivered for the specific purpose of being believed. You carry the clarity to tell the difference. Trust it. You are fully entitled to receive someone's return with warmth and a closed door. You are entitled to acknowledge genuine regret without making yourself available again to the pattern that produced the harm. You are entitled to hold someone in goodwill from a distance that protects everything you have built in their absence. That is not coldness. That is the sovereignty of someone who knows exactly what they have and exactly what it costs to arrive here. Real power has never been loud. Real power has never been the ability to control someone else's emotional state, to direct their attention on demand, to keep another person dependent on your approval as their primary source of self-worth. What is often performed as power, the running hot and cold, the strategic withdrawal, the deliberate management of access, is not power at all. It is need wearing a dominant costume. It is the specific behavior of someone who requires your emotional engagement to feel significant. Remove that engagement, and there is nothing underneath it capable of sustaining itself. That is what your departure exposed. Behind all the control was dependency. Behind the leverage was the constant, quiet terror of what would happen when the leverage stopped working. Behind the performance of not needing you was the absolute requirement of being needed by you. You removed that requirement, and the entire structure lost its ability to stand. What you demonstrated in leaving and what you continue to demonstrate through your peace, your forward movement and your life being lived on your own terms is something entirely different from the performance of power. Real power is the ability to know your own worth so completely that the withholding of someone else's validation produces no collapse in you. Real power is the peace you carry right now, which does not require favorable external conditions to remain intact. Real power is the capacity to be fully present with yourself and discover that the presence is extraordinary. You built that. In the quiet, in the difficult days, in the moments when returning would have been easier and you chose yourself instead. What you constructed is not attached to anything external. It lives in you. It strengthens rather than weakens under pressure. It does not depend on being recognized or acknowledged by anyone else to be absolutely real. They looked powerful, they were not. You looked like someone who needed them. You did not. Your absence removed every layer of performance from both of you, and what was revealed underneath confirmed exactly what they had always feared was true about the balance of this dynamic. There is a destination on this path that is worth naming clearly, because it is the most complete expression of everything your absence has been quietly building toward. You are moving toward genuine indifference. If you have not fully arrived there yet, you are already in motion toward it. And when you reach it, you will understand something that permanently recalibrates every relationship that follows. Indifference is not a lack of feeling, it is not the suppression of unresolved emotion, and it is not the performance of moving on before the actual movement has occurred. Genuine indifference is what becomes available after you have processed something completely, after the full weight of an experience has been walked through, examined, integrated, and genuinely released. It is what exists on the other side of grief that was allowed to complete itself rather than being prematurely cut short. When you arrive there, their name surfaces and your internal response is simply settled, not charged with love or charged with resentment or weighted with the particular ache of something that remains unresolved. Just a clean, clear recognition, a chapter understood to be fully closed. A person who belonged to a prior season of your life, whose presence taught you things of real value, who is no longer part of your present, acknowledged without electricity. That quality of settled recognition cannot be performed convincingly. It is either genuinely present or it is not. And it communicates itself without any effort from you, through the texture of your energy, through the way you carry yourself, through the visible quality of someone who has actually moved past something, rather than someone who is managing ongoing attachment to it. For a person whose entire sense of significance in your life was rooted in the emotional charge they produced in you, that indifference is more devastating than any direct confrontation could ever have been. To evoke strong feeling, even negative strong feeling, is to remain relevant. To be received with settled neutrality by someone who once cared with real depth is to be confirmed as having passed entirely out of that person's emotional present. And that confirmation, arriving not through anything said, but through the unmistakable quality of genuine release, delivers the final verdict without a single word. You did not bring this as punishment. You arrived at it through the natural completion of your own healing. But the weight it carries for them is the same regardless. You have become unreachable, and that is your final complete freedom. Everything you moved through was the preparation for the version of yourself who exists right now. Not punishment handed down without reason. Not a detour that cost you time you should have spent elsewhere. It was the necessary curriculum for the specific kind of person you were always being built into. Every season of difficulty that a chosen one moves through is calibrated precisely to what they are being made ready for, and you have been made ready for something significant. The version of you standing on this side of that experience carries something the earlier version was still in the process of developing. Not simply resilience, though that is real. Not simply experience, though that matters. Discernment. The lived, unshakable, embodied ability to feel the difference between a connection that genuinely sees you and one that merely uses you. Between someone who is growing alongside you and someone who is performing growth in order to regain access. Between a dynamic built on mutual elevation and one built on the quiet management of your energy for someone else's benefit. That discernment cannot be taught in a classroom or absorbed through second-hand experience. It is only available through the specific encounter of having needed it and not yet had it, and paying the full price of that gap. You paid that price. And what you received in exchange is a quality of perception that belongs to you permanently and that changes everything about what you will attract and what you will allow going forward. What is arriving in your life now, or what is assembling to arrive, is calibrated to the version of you that actually exists, not the edited version that made itself smaller to fit somewhere it was never fully welcome. The whole version. The sovereign, clear-eyed, fully present version that knows what alignment feels like because you have now lived what its absence costs. The people who belong in this next chapter of your life will recognize that version of you immediately. They will not require you to perform your worth. They will not make you earn what should simply be given. They will arrive with the same quality of presence and consistency that you yourself have always brought, because that is the frequency that now matches yours. Your absence did not just close something. They'd created the conditions for everything that was always meant to find you. You came in full. You gave everything that someone of your depth and character gives. You held the line longer than you needed to, because that is who you are. And when you finally left, when you honored the truth your instincts had been telling you for longer than you want to remember, you did it with the quiet authority of someone who does not need an audience to confirm the validity of a decision. Your worst fear was that you were not enough. Their worst fear was that you were more than they could handle, and that you would eventually arrive at the understanding that their validation of your worth was never required for your worth to be real. You arrived, and the moment you did, every fear they had been carrying underneath the surface of that dynamic was confirmed. Not through anything said, not through any action designed to deliver a message, through your peace, through your forward movement, through the simple, sovereign, undeniable fact of you continuing to become more fully yourself without them. Those words your absence communicated, the words that carried more weight than anything said across the entire duration of what you shared. I don't need you anymore, not as strategy, not as performance, as the complete, permanent, lived truth of a person who finally reclaimed the power that was always theirs. That is what you claimed in the silence. That is what you built in the absence. That is what you are carrying forward, not just past this, but into every chapter that comes after this one, as the foundation of everything you will build and every person you will allow close. You are not going back, You are moving forward as the fullest, freest, most sovereign version of yourself, and that version of you, the one that emerged from everything you survived, is exactly who this next chapter was written for. Now go live it.